Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. The Responsible Edge podcast is your go-to source for lessons in how to implement ethical and effective marketing strategies. So today I was delighted to be joined by Callum Miller of Ethy. I'll let Callum perhaps do a bit more of the introduction in the episode itself, but Callum is the CEO and co-founder of Ethy, which is a digital platform on a mission to simplify sustainability. Today's conversation was really interesting, kind of focused on initially an article that came out last year regarding some research and the lack of kind of accessibility that SMEs were experiencing or feeling towards engaging with their sustainability kind of journey. We then talked a little bit from Callum's perspective on the importance of actually just starting that journey and how actually sustainability is not a binary concept at all, and that it's something that we can, as long as we're open and honest and potentially honorable about, we can sort of begin to communicate at least the things that we're doing and the vision that we have for our businesses. So that was really interesting. We then talked a little bit about transparency and accountability and how that relates to some of the work that's been done at Ethy and some of the solutions they were able to provide their SME clients. And then finally, Callum finished things with a really interesting bit of advice for junior marketeers out there, talking about the need to kind of stimulate internal engagement with sustainability before looking to kind of create promotional strategies around sustainability credentials. So I'm really delighted to have Callum on today. There was a lot of energy in the room. Hopefully my hosting skills are improved and you guys are enjoying this next show. So thanks again for listening. As always, if you do have any comments, please do leave them for us. Thank you. Callum, thank you again. Just to say thank you so much for agreeing to join us on the Responsible Edge today. I guess just to kind of kick off, it would just be really interesting to hear a bit more about you and your background, and then as I said, maybe just what had sort of drew you to the opportunity to come and joining us on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely, Charlie. Thanks very much, first and foremost, for having me on. It's a real pleasure. So I'm Callum. I am CEO and one of 3 co-founders of a company called Ethy. Really, we're a kind of digital sustainability solution, predominantly aimed at SMEs, aiming to simplify sustainability really in 2 areas. So firstly, it's helping them with their marketing, so overcoming some key challenges which are very relevant to Responsible Edge 2, i.e. greenwashing, general distrust in the market, so ensuring that credibility when they talk about their sustainability efforts. And then the second area is also really helping them with taking action, so helping them kind of approach sustainability in a much more granular way, so kind of step by step, taking out lots of the complexities and really kind of accepting that most SMEs don't have a sustainability team or manager in-house. So we want to really provide that kind of level of support just to make sustainability a bit more accessible for them. So we set Ethy up, so it's coming up to 3 years now. Myself and 2 other co-founders. Personally speaking, my kind of inspiration and the spark for the company was probably a combination of 2 factors. Very much sustainability in my personal life, so it's a growing interest. How can I, as an individual, contribute to the kind of climate crisis and make small changes in my day-to-day life? And then that with more of a professional interest regarding technology in my previous career and life prior to starting the company, and really kind of leveraging technology to kind of combat global warming and make sustainability a bit more accessible to growing and smaller companies.
Callum, that was absolutely one of the most sensational nutshell introductions I think we've had. That was as polished as it comes. You mentioned to me before we started this that this is like, I think, the 2nd or 3rd podcast that you've actually done. I don't think that you could get any more polished in terms of your introduction. That was absolutely wonderful. A couple of things I just want to pry into with that. You mentioned your background and from a professional perspective, some of the things that you've done that kind of led you into Ethy. Can you just give us a bit more of a flavour of what that background actually entailed?
Yeah, it's really random, very varied in terms of my life before Ethy. So I'm only 28.
We like varied.
So I grew up really a football maniac. So I played for various kind of professional clubs, youth level, always kind of anticipated maybe taking that next step and becoming a professional footballer by the age of maybe 18, 19. Didn't quite happen. I then went off to study paramedic science, worked as a paramedic for 2 years, realized I wasn't a great paramedic either, and then went back to a topic that I really liked, going back to university to study history. Really enjoyed it, but ultimately didn't really see that through in terms of career development. And then landed myself a kind of tech graduate position at a company called Sparta Global for 2 years. And that was what kind of installed that kind of interest in technology and kind of the digital world, really. And then, like I said, that coupled with a personal interest in sustainability really inspired me just to take that next step and begin Ethy back in 2020. So, really random, varied. Who knows what the next 3-4 years have in store? We'll see.
I was going to say, what on earth could your next sort of career change be at the end of it? At the point at which Ethy's realised its potential. Fascinating. I've got one very important question, which is, what was your position as a footballer?
So that started off as centre mid in my kind of prime years up until kind of 14, 15, then I guess relegated more to right back as I began to, I guess, get less and less competitive. So I need to get back into it from a kind of fitness perspective, but centre mid mostly.
I love that. So first of all, the idea that the prime years were the ages of 14, 15, I think is and sensational. And the idea that you almost did sort of an inverted Philip Lahm. You went from centre mid to right back as opposed to right mid to centre mid. Interesting. Trent Alexander-Arnold, perhaps, for Liverpool. The reverse of. Anyway, clearly we're going to need to have another podcast to talk about football because that's a particular area of interest for me too. But just prying into, you talked about, obviously that's really interesting in terms of your professional background, as you say, incredibly varied. In terms of you mentioned the personal interest in sustainability and can you just touch on that? Like what was it about that from your personal experience that was so key and inspirational in terms of choosing to set up Ethy?
Yeah, I think kind of going way back to the start, I've always had, I guess, a close affinity with just nature and the great outdoors. Like my dad and his family live up in Scotland, so got kind of hiking quite regularly 3-4 times a year. Loved the Highlands, spending time outdoors. And I think it was kind of that which made me realize actually like this won't be around much longer unless we kind of take action to preserve the outdoors. I think people often don't make that connection. But I did slightly not later in life, but maybe kind of early 20s, began to really realize they're fundamentally connected. And then as a result, felt a responsibility that I need to act, as many of my friends and kind of family do as well, to varying degrees. So I think it was originally that kind of love of the outdoors, which kind of, sparked that interest.
And when you say, and that's fascinating. So when you say that often people don't maybe appreciate that sort of association, I guess, with all of this, language that we're hearing around carbon. Well, in fact, all of this sort of growing need for carbon literacy and understanding of the environmental issues affecting us. That actually the relationship between that understanding and what impact it's going to have upon your experiences of the nature around you, is that's the thing for you that's missing perhaps in terms of the collective consciousness.
I think so, yeah. I mean, you hear a lot, obviously, as we should, around the kind of climate emergency. But I guess it doesn't really feel that tangible, especially here in the West, where we're kind of, I guess, lesser affected by the implications of climate change. You kind of look around, it feels like everything is kind of running as normal. We get the seasons, especially in the UK, weather's so unpredictable anyway. So I think for a lot of people, it just doesn't really feel like, I guess, you can kind of touch it or feel it. And it's, I guess, not until it's too late that people really start to kind of clock on. But I guess it all comes down to education and kind of getting people to kind of delve into the details and really understand that what we have now is in jeopardy unless things change.
It's fascinating. I couldn't agree more with you. I'm just reflecting on that point myself in terms of especially here in the UK, our sense of sort of disconnect slightly from the floods, the wildfires, etc. Although I have to admit, one thing that really did strike me, was it last year or the year before, when we had actual wildfires here in the UK and around the M25, etc. That was a bit of a sort of take a step back and wow, this is actually happening here in the UK now. I don't know, did you feel the same with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was in Greece last year as well, and you probably heard about the
Of course.
wildfires there. It was just absolutely widespread, and we were really kind of close. Like visually, we could see it. We're on the ferries, and we could see it happening across the various islands. And yeah, I mean, it's shocking. But I think that kind of reality often just sets in when it's too late, and you shouldn't really need to see it firsthand, I guess, before you kind of realize it's actually happening.
Isn't it the conundrum of the human condition that we don't start actually doing things until they directly are affecting us? Fascinating, Callum. Thank you. That's been a really interesting kind of introduction to you and your background. As we always do, Callum, we kind of like to start sort of next phase of our conversation looking at kind of a topic, something newsworthy. I think we shared with you an article from the London Loves Business publication, I think from last year, referencing a piece of research. Would you mind just giving us a sort of a brief synopsis and perhaps your initial thoughts on what was covered in that piece?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really pivotal kind of piece, and it's a pivotal article for in terms of it needs to be kind of spread. The awareness needs to be there that SMEs are kind of the result of SMEs. We're looking at 50%-ish, 40 to 50% of business sector emissions. And on the flip side, SMEs are largely, or many of them are disengaged with sustainability. And that's a huge issue if we are working towards kind of net zero by 2030. This is a kind of type of business which needs to be central to that transition, which it very much isn't at the moment.
Yeah, fascinating. And did you? I thought it was interesting, sort of the research highlighting, I guess, the particular issues that businesses, SMEs were suggesting were causing them to be disengaged, I guess, with developing their sustainability credentials or looking to promote them, and that being the lack of government support, perhaps the lack of tax incentives, etc. Can you maybe just touch a little bit more on what you see are the biggest problems facing SMEs in terms of taking these steps?
Yeah, I think it's varied. A few that stand out for me is many of the solutions just are very much targeted towards kind of enterprise level clients. If we look at kind of carbon management systems, they just simply do not cater for SMEs, both in terms of functionality and also the kind of costings and pricings. Having said that, I mean, there are some companies which are starting. We work with a company called Small 99. Their mission is to get 1 million SMEs towards net zero. So they're starting to realize that, yeah, this is a very much underserved size of business. But yeah, we need more. We really do need more. We need more innovation, more funding, which allows these businesses to engage. Obviously, I think coming out the back of it, or not yet coming out the back, but hopefully starting to see some signs in terms of coming out of a recession. I think there's been a big issue over the last kind of 3-4 years in terms of how much money do these businesses have to spend on their sustainability strategy. Probably not much, especially when you look at the kind of smaller businesses, the S from that SME. So I think, yeah, the financial side's pivotal. And then what you kind of touched on there in terms of government grants and incentives from kind of the top level, very much missing. That there really isn't much out there at all. As much as the government talks around net zero being central to their strategy, they're not incentivizing SMEs enough or supporting them to engage with sustainability.
Absolutely brilliant answer, Callum. Really, really clear and succinct. And out of interest, if you're sat down, and I'm pitching this with perhaps just taking your Ethy hat off for a moment and just sort of thinking more broadly about a conversation that you might have with an SME owner, if you like, who says, you know, guys, we really have the intention to go green and to be able to maybe, I guess, benefit from being able to promote ourselves as such, which is obviously a key part of why, you know, we might be doing it. But ultimately, from a cost perspective, doing so is just prohibitive, to the point where going green would essentially mean that we were not able to trade. Like, what would be your kind of key advice to that owner of that business in terms of what they can do at that stage in order to at least begin to plan for a more sort of sustainable future for their business?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think firstly, it's probably important to kind of understand that sustainability isn't binary. Businesses aren't kind of not sustainable or sustainable. In fact, no business will ever be 100% sustainable. There's always a mark left on the environment. So we really like to think of it as a journey, very much step by step, and those small steps over an extended period do add up to a kind of significant impact. So in light of that, we think about things that maybe don't cost so much. There's lots of measures that businesses can take, obviously depending on industry, they can take which don't have a huge expense. And actually, in fact, some measures and things businesses can do result in cost savings, especially looking at things like kind of energy efficiency in facilities, circular economic principles, not having to source new materials from the supply chain. Things like that can probably be tackled earlier on than perhaps larger initiatives that do have a kind of larger price tag. So it's really about identifying what do we have available to us in terms of financial resource, time resource, and then putting that to use and just making a start on that journey, I think.
And that's fascinating, Callum, because by distinguishing or stating that it is ultimately a journey, and that therefore there is that sort of starting point, regardless almost of what that starting point is, that actually makes going on a sustainability journey for any business accessible. It just has to be very clear and evident as to what those sustainability initiatives are, even at that very early embryonic, we're not big enough to invest in these other maybe larger, more significant solutions, but we're at least taking those first steps. Would you sort of agree with that?
100%. And I think maybe a large part of the problem is that businesses just don't know what those first steps are. There's a huge amount of information out there, lots of it misinformation, and actually kind of knowing, okay, maybe we can do X or Y or Z. That sometimes is, I guess, a surprise, and not kind of going too deep into Ethy again, but it's very much why we try and have this kind of bite-sized framework that really shows kind of, okay, here are some actions you can initially take, and then perhaps when resource permits in the future, you can begin to tackle these other initiatives. So I do, genuinely believe there's always things businesses can do just to take that step further.
Yeah, fantastic. And then I must, before we move on to sort of move away slightly from the article itself, I've got to get your take upon the political environment that we find ourselves in, specifically here in the UK, in terms of the support of SMEs and going green, essentially. What you mentioned there, that there's a lack of support. Do you see there being optimism for the future? What does that need to look like? How would you like to see things change?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really quite tricky. I mean, as we know, government's really sporadic. We don't know what they have in store next. And obviously words often don't result in actual action, as we've seen time and time again. So it's hard to predict what's kind of coming our way. But I do think that there needs to be that kind of platform of support. I think it needs to be financial. I do think there needs to be financial advantage for the businesses that are taking action. We live in a capitalistic society. In order for businesses to kind of make change, they often do need to see that kind of tangible monetary advantage from doing so. And it's just not there really. But then also looking, I guess, at the top level, we need to see something similar from the big players who do result in a kind of the largest proportion of emissions, and ensuring they do combat that as well. So I think it has to happen, both for the kind of really large corporations as well as the SMEs. And it does need to come down to finance. How that kind of takes shape or looks, and I'm not sure, but it's very much needed.
Well, there you go. Maybe that's we mentioned what your next career path might look like. Getting involved in whipping some policy together to support SMEs would be a good one. You'd certainly have a supporter here, Callum, from everything that you've
That's enough
so far. The sample of one. But yes, moving on slightly, in light of the article, just wanting to talk more specifically about ethical and responsible kind of marketing practice. You've alluded to, I think, right at the start of the conversation, around the kind of skepticism associated with green claims, etc. In terms of SMEs, like, what do you think are the sort of key strategies that they can employ, or processes they can go through in order to ensure that what they're presenting is perceived as genuine, and not tipping over into greenwashing? What are those kind of key recommendations from your end on what they should be doing?
Yeah, I think there's a few particular areas which are probably most important, and obviously kind of third-party validation on claims made is really quite pivotal. As we know, there's a huge amount of greenwashing going on in the marketplace. So businesses that do have that, I guess, independent stamp of approval can really, differentiate from those without. And it goes a long way in installing that trust that many individuals look for when making a purchase. So I think that's one. Another one, I guess, which is perhaps less focused on, which I think is also really quite important, is also being open about some of the pitfalls and things perhaps businesses aren't doing so well, in terms of, okay, we're doing X, Y, and Z, but this is an area we can't quite kind of complete at this stage. I think that goes a long way in terms of building rapport and strong relationships with customers and other stakeholders. So I think really it comes down to transparency, just trying to be as kind of open about the current situation the business is in as possible, and making sure that kind of gets through in a clear and kind of comprehensible way.
And I suppose that's really interesting, Callum. Going back to your previous point when we were talking about, ultimately a sustainability journey is accessible to any organization, regardless of size. It just comes down to being open and honest about what the sustainability initiatives are that you're able to implement at that point. But then if you combine that with a more genuine openness and transparency about perhaps the other areas that you're not able to invest in yet, but you have ambitions to and a plan to in the future, combining those two things, it creates a kind of a credible positioning. Again, not an open question, but your thoughts on that? Is that your thinking in terms of how we go about encouraging SMEs to start the journey?
Yeah, no, I absolutely, believe that is the case. I think it just, like I said, comes down to transparency, and businesses, how often do they kind of come clean about some of the areas they're not investing in at the moment, and the ones that do, which I think are kind of few and far between at the moment, it definitely pays dividends in terms of relationships with clients. And again, going back to that term, it's a journey. I think consumers and people get that. They get that businesses are on that kind of continuous improvement process. So many businesses, I think, are kind of afraid to open up about areas of things they're not doing as well as they should be. But absolutely, it should be done, and it's a means to, like I said, differentiate from those who aren't.
We literally had another podcast episode where we were with the guests. We were talking all about vulnerability, and like it was an interesting discussion around, like, I think it was Benny Bron. I might have butchered her name there, but obviously she, I think, sort of popularized the use of the term vulnerability and talking about like personal development, etc. But I guess we were talking about, like, do we see vulnerability as something that could be adopted into the kind of corporate language, because obviously it's got that association of perhaps weakness previously, that kind of thing. But actually, from what you're describing here, it is transparency and ability to be vulnerable and to say, look, we're not perfect. We're a group of humans, part of an organization that are trying to do something positive, but we're open and honest and are happy to be vulnerable in terms of those areas that we need to improve. So it sounds to me like you're quite aligned with that notion of vulnerability being key.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think it also, kind of on top of what we just discussed, being open about kind of pitfalls, it also kind of implements a sense of accountability for the business, in terms of once they've made something public that perhaps they're not so good at, they then almost have a responsibility to improve in that area. Perhaps they report on that in their kind of annual ESG sustainability report, or another kind of format. But once you've kind of, I guess, put it out into the open, you do feel like you need to then action that and improve in that area. So I think it benefits in various ways. Very
interesting. Coming back to your point before, you mentioned that there were those kind of two key areas, if you like, that you think that any SME should be kind of looking to adopt. And the first was looking at third-party verification of claims. Now, I know we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about Ethy at the end of the conversation, but obviously not all like eco labels and third-party verifiers are sort of built the same, and certainly have different processes and obviously different costs associated with them. what would be your, you're an SME, you're running a business, you're thinking, right, how do we balance obviously wanting to have the very best verification of our claims that we can possibly have with perhaps our budgets, need to be factored into this as well. Like, what would be your advice to that that leader of that organization in terms of the decision making around who to work with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's loads of different aspects that need to be considered. I think first and foremost, the kind of methodology of the verification or the assessment process has to be a key consideration. Like you said, not all certifications are created equal. Some are very much a tick box exercise. And then on the flip side, you have other certifications, which you're talking kind of years of assessment and kind of, like evidence, needing heavy evidence that needs to be provided. So it does vary quite significantly. But then I guess when you look at the two, often the kind of easier access certifications come with a much lower price tag than the more robust methodologies. Meaning, for going back to the SME topic, those really quite big certifications aren't always accessible, even though the methodology might be better. So I think compromise sometimes has to take place. I think not all businesses can afford, for instance, to become a B Corp, but they might have ambitions to do that later down the line. So again, it's about that journey and saying, once we have the resource, we can then invest in this. But I think admittedly, there is an issue with just how many of them there are. And I think that there can be a risk in terms of saturating the kind of certification marketplace. Having too many of the same type of certification as well can potentially be a bit confusing for customers and other stakeholders. So I think, it's important just to consider what's right for our business, what reflects our brand, what methodology do we believe in, and kind of, take it kind of case by case, what kind of your unique requirements as a business are.
Yeah, really interesting and great advice, Callum. And out of interest, looking at kind of the EU directive and looking at some of the sort of tighter restrictions they're placing on eco labels in particular, do you see there being things that we could possibly learn from Europe in terms of specifically trying to tighten things up? Because you're right, it's a bit of a Wild West scenario out here at the moment in the UK, isn't it, when it comes to eco labels?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the EU tend to be slightly ahead of the UK market. The UK tend to follow suit several years down the line. But I think what they're doing is really much needed in terms of addressing some key terminology, which just isn't it is misleading many consumers. You're looking at terms like kind of carbon neutral, carbon negative. I think energy efficient is one which is also under some scrutiny in terms of what does that terminology actually mean to a potential consumer or other stakeholder? So I think we need to knuckle down on these terms as well and make sure things like certifications and the language that businesses are using to communicate sustainability really do reflect the exact actions that they're taking. And then in regard to more of the certification space, in terms of, so what they're looking at is almost having a kind of standardized certification ecosystem, whereby there's almost like a certification above the rest of the certifications. I think that's quite important. I think there's some really good elements to that in terms of making sure they're all robust and they're all kind of applying with different regulations. But there could potentially be a slight risk in terms of almost putting off new certifications from coming to fruition and making the kind of just the space much too difficult to actually enter. So I think that there's definitely pros and cons. In terms of tackling that misleading terminology, I think that's much needed, and we hopefully will see similar regulation in the UK soon.
Yeah, no, I would wholeheartedly agree with that position. And as you say, we don't want to stagnate innovation in standards and eco labels, etc., because that's how ultimately that side of things can be improved. I want to go back slightly to, we were talking about greenwashing in particular there, and how we go about kind of mitigating against greenwashing. Now, a lot of the research that we've done, a lot of things that we've been looking into, has been looking into the fact that a lot of greenwashing is not, it's not intentional in many ways. It's ultimately down to a lack of understanding, a lack of appreciation of the use of language, as you've kind of very eloquently alluded to. What's your take on what SMEs could be doing in order to mitigate against that form of greenwashing, i.e., the non-intentional form?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I guess putting myself in the shoes of a kind of SME business owner, I want to do everything I can to differentiate the business and give us some really strong USPs, as we know sustainability can be. So in that sense, I want to shout about everything I'm doing and really amplify that voice to stand out in the market. But yeah, in terms of mitigating, it still comes down to having that kind of third-party backing. I think that's a really important aspect, and looking for certifications which are kind of lower price points. There are a few of them in the market now, which is good. I think it also just comes down to getting advice from the likes of your organization, from ours, speaking to people in that space in order to kind of advise on how do we communicate this particular initiative. I think it is quite a collaborative space. If you look at sustainability, and people are aligned on their mission and very keen to provide that support. So it's about, building that network, getting that kind of expert support. Ultimately, if we're looking at smaller SMEs, I think the risk associated with greenwashing and making misleading claims isn't really there, I guess, for the really small companies. They're not going to be the ones who are heavily scrutinized by the likes of the ASA or the CMA. It's going to be the bigger kind of corporate companies, rightly so. So I think probably, not speaking for every SME, but a lot of them probably don't consider it as a risk. But I think when you have that kind of a collective, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of SMEs making misleading claims, that can be a real issue. But on a kind of micro level per SME, I don't think it's really at kind of the front of mind. They're very focused on kind of growth and really just making sure the business stays solvent, which is really quite tricky at the moment. So it's difficult.
And out of interest, if we look at like sustainability credentials, green credentials, if you like, as being, as you've alluded to there, like something that can be leveraged by SMEs to help position the company more competitively ultimately, and there's a competitive advantage associated with doing so. Like, what's your take on green hushing and that fear and the impact that has on SMEs' likelihood to be able to share their credentials confidently? I know you've just alluded to the fact that actually in terms of regulation and issues with the CMA and ASA, it's less likely to be so, but green hushing is still a big issue when it comes to that confidence. What I think I know what you're going to suggest the answer to this is, but yeah, what's your take on the issue of green hushing?
Yeah, I think the implications of green hushing are very similar to greenwashing in terms of just lack of transparency and kind of just misleading consumers. Obviously, the effect on the business is different, but from a consumer perspective, you're not getting the insight that you're looking for, and as a result, you can't make informed choices. So I think, it's sad to see that businesses don't feel comfortable in expressing the good work and the positive impact they're having as a result of compliance, which I think, again, it comes down to having that kind of expert guidance, or kind of, being able to say we're comfortable in terms of, expressing these initiatives. So I think, again, it's just kind of exasperating the issue of lack of transparency in the market.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I think, you talk about that guidance. It's that education, isn't it? On a sort of an individual level, perhaps within an organization, whereby, you really do want that marketeer that sat there quivering at the tweet space, if you like, or the article that they're putting together, thinking, God, I don't want to get this wrong, and I don't want to be found out for something. For them to have the knowledge, the backing, the understanding, but also perhaps from what you've described, almost the sort of the kind of cultural context, if you like, whereby their marketing director or marketing manager, and perhaps the CEO or managing director of the company, has instilled this sense of, as long as we are open and honest and transparent about where we are and where we're looking to go to, then communicating in this way about these things that we're doing, we're comfortable doing, and therefore I empower you to do so. So would you suggest that cultural element is kind of important for enabling the confidence in your marketing function to be able to share these credentials more comfortably?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, the key word, like you mentioned there, is kind of education and understanding the market. A lot of it does just come down to the way things are, I guess, worded. Again, nothing's binary. It's always about kind of expressing things in a way in terms of we're making efforts in this particular space. This is what's coming further down the line. This is what we're not so good at. So I think it comes down to the real kind of nitty gritty of the communication, if you like. And I think it's important for businesses to feel confident in expressing this area. We know that it's such a key consideration for so many people, especially in the UK, where they're looking to kind of pay for a product or service. They want to know what that business is doing. They want to know the impact they're having when they purchase that particular good. So I think, the CMO should be empowered to speak confidently about what they're doing, but also kind of have the backing and education to make sure they feel comfortable, that it's not misleading anyone, if you like.
No, very much. Yeah, again, singing from very much the same hymn sheet there, which is great. Callum, let's switch focus slightly and talk a little bit more about Ethy, which we've kind of alluded to, I guess, throughout the conversation. Give us an idea. I mean, we're obviously particularly interested in that kind of the first part of your introduction regarding how you enable Ethy clients to more confidently communicate and market their sustainability credentials. Can you just give us like a bit more of a flavor and understanding about how you guys go about sort of enabling that for your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So the marketing aspect of what we do is really underpinned, if you like, by a sustainability framework. So we've built this sustainability framework, which is continuing to evolve over the last 3 years, working with various kind of expert bodies, if you like, across both sustainability, ESG, but also responsible marketing bodies, in order to create quite a comprehensive set of standards. So we have just over 40 standards in the framework, with which are these kind of bite-sized sustainability considerations, from kind of measuring your carbon emissions to recyclable packaging, also some social considerations like employee empowerment. We've got a kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion standard coming out hopefully next month. So what we've got is this framework that businesses can use to verify their actions against. So firstly, to have to basically put forward a form of evidence to demonstrate that they do follow that practice. And as a result, they're then awarded what we call an eco-label, which is really a kind of visual signpost representing that standard, representing that practice. And the idea being that eco-label is a really clear and easy way to communicate that initiative to customers, whether it's on your website or various different marketing channels, and get across that particular initiative really quite easily, but also with the consumer understanding that it has that third party approval. So this all kind of takes place on a digital dashboard. So we've tried to make the process of assessment quite efficient and easy to follow, making sure it's still robust, but making sure it's not going to take months, years, which I think again puts it for some kind of businesses out of scope, especially when you're talking about businesses with maybe 4 or 5 employees. They don't have yet that much resource to put into the certification process. So we've tried to make, like I said, quite efficient, easy to run through, and then ultimately give them all of the marketing and communication tools to make sure they're communicating each initiative in line with the action and the evidence they've provided.
And what does that? I'm fascinated by that. I think what you've described in terms of the initial kind of eco-labeling part of the process is, I mean, the thing that just struck me, I know we've spoken about it throughout, but it's almost confidence internally that we have this thing, that we've achieved this thing, and that we have it verified by a third party, and then obviously sharing that confidence with your consumer, who looks at and sees that label and understands that relates to part of your operation. But coming back to your point about, okay, we've got that in place now. You mentioned tools and the things that you do to kind of help them then communicate that standard that they've reached and able to communicate. Like, what does that entail?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's very much the kind of second function of the framework, if you like. So the first function is, like I said, being able to verify against the standards. The second function of the framework is really to use it to plan for sustainability. So, i.e. creating your roadmap, we allow businesses to essentially flag that they're working towards particular initiatives. So they might be working towards becoming a more energy efficient business. They might be working towards installing more circular economic principles. And then once they do so on the Ethy dashboard, we come in and provide a level of support, generally through vetted partners. So we'll have partners across the standards. So we might have a partner in the kind of carbon reporting space. We might have a partner in the recyclability space. We'll then make the introduction to that partner, and they'll work with the client to install that particular initiative and get them up to the standard that we require. So it's really kind of trying to build that full circle approach of planning for sustainability, gaining support to implement the particular practices you set out to implement, and then marketing them in a responsible and transparent way. Just ultimately kind of, being that port of call for SMEs and making everything a bit easier.
It's really cool, Callum. Just on that kind of, as I go through that circle, that last bit of like, we've nailed this standard, like we've been working, we wanted to become, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher this, but, we wanted to become plastic free. And then we worked with Ethy to kind of get to the point where we can now say that we are. In terms of that final bit, yes, I've got my stamp. I can add that to my website. I can put it on my packaging, et cetera, et cetera. Is there like further support you guys offer about how I can go about responsibly communicating what that actually means in terms of language that I use, in terms of the messaging that's associated with it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important topic, and it's an area we've had lots of feedback and really requests for, especially last year. So what we've kind of built within that partner ecosystem is also kind of a group of ethical, well, we've kind of brought in a group of ethical, kind of responsible marketing agencies who can then work with the business beyond the eco-label being awarded to actually build it into a much wider narrative and make sure things like the wording, communication, display and structure is all aligned and kind of, making sure it's kind of up to scratch with what they do. So it's not something we really do kind of in-house, but we have the partners in our network who can support with that next stage.
Okay, that's really interesting. Perhaps that's one for after we finish the podcast.
I think so.
Very interesting. In terms of if you were, imagine I'm an SME and I'm going back to the beginning of our conversation, I'm thinking about what eco labels I might look to work with, and I come across kind of Ethy and the potential for working with you guys. Like, what would be the key things that you would want me to understand about Ethy and about the process in consideration or comparison to the other options that are available to me? What are the kind of key headlines that would draw me to you guys?
Yeah, I think our model is quite different in the sense. So we really don't like to think of ourselves as like a traditional or conventional form of certification. We're more kind of on the communication side. So I think the most common comparison that our kind of clients or prospects make is B Corp or Ethy. And really, we like to say it's very much complementary rather than competitive. B Corp is that huge, very well-known brand. The kind of methodology and the assessment is very extensive. They look into every aspect of the business's operations. Ethy, on the other hand, provides a more granular communication tool to really showcase all the individual initiatives the business is making, which we know that people buying products they really want to see, i.e. some individuals might be more inclined to choose a business that is very socially responsible. Others might be more inclined to choose a business that really cares for the environment and make sure they don't impact the environment negatively. So we give the businesses the tools to really showcase that the granular impact they're having, all the different initiatives they're having collectively, to give that kind of snapshot in regard to their sustainability journey. And then I think the second one has to be kind of cost. We have tried to make the kind of model, the pricing model, accessible to businesses of all shapes and sizes. So we've got businesses, well, many kind of one-person enterprise businesses using Ethy at the moment, and then all the way up to much larger, almost, I think we have a few kind of £1 billion revenue businesses as well. So we've tried to make it, like I said, available to businesses of all sizes by providing kind of lower fees for the smaller SMEs as well.
That's really interesting, Callum. I think it's so commendable that you guys at Ethy have built something that is that accessible. And I think that's from my experience in the kind of space, it's a really commendable thing. I've got one question that I hope isn't. I hope it doesn't come across as a difficult question, or me trying to be difficult. But let's just say, like, hypothetically, we have a situation in which there's like an Ethy client who, has a number of different eco labels, and they've been verified and they've been through, and they're plastic free, and support their staff correctly, or I'm sorry, I'm going to get my terminology wrong, but essentially, they've got a few labels in place, but fundamentally, regardless of sort of acknowledging those, there's some really sort of fundamental ethical issues relating to the business and what they're doing, either in terms of the sector or in terms of various other operations that perhaps they're not looking to try and communicate. How do you guys deal with or address that issue?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's probably something we're going to have to directly address perhaps further down the line. We haven't really come against that particular scenario to date. Most of the businesses that we attract tend to be the ones who do take sustainability seriously. But we do have various measures to mitigate that if it happens. So first and foremost, there's a minimum requirement to join Ethy, i.e. the business has to be eligible for at least 3 of our standards and eco labels. Which we believe at least shows that kind of initial dedication or commitment to more sustainable practices. And then secondly, I think a lot of it just comes down to common sense when we choose to bring on a new business, in terms of we wouldn't work with anyone in the kind of fossil fuel oil space or kind of similar. So we tend to kind of get to know our clients or upcoming clients quite well before we actually bring them on. And yeah, ultimately kind of try and make sure that they're not behind the scenes really going against what we're demonstrating them to do. I think that the last thing I was going to say as well is that I can't remember, but that's kind of we'll remember after this, and I'll let you know. But it's escaping me. Apologies, Charlie.
Episode 2, Callum. Episode 2. We want to have there to be something to come back to. Callum, that's been super interesting. Do you know what? We've actually flown through 45 minutes. For me personally, that was a really quick fire 45 minutes. Final thing that we always ask people on the show to just give us is thinking back to, and I know you've had a very varied kind of early career, if you like, and perhaps haven't worked specifically as a junior marketeer or communication specialist, but what would be your kind of number one, bit of advice that you would offer to somebody starting out their career in terms of wanting to ensure that they practice responsible or ethical marketing moving forward?
Yeah, so I think, there's plenty of advice I could probably give. I think one bit that I would say, which has been quite evident through the various clients we've worked with, is it has to start internally. So the team need to be incentivized. And I mean, everyone in the team, if you're talking about a big business with various departments, it really does need to be across departments, because ultimately it is a collective journey. So we need everyone in the business to really be behind it, and ultimately have that kind of cultural shift towards more kind of responsible operations. So I think if there is someone in that business, and that the person that is listening to this podcast is that champion in the business who really wants to inspire or be that spark for change, it's very important to start with the team and the individuals in that team first, before going out and kind of making it all public and building on things.
That's a really good bit of advice, and not something that we've had from people, that actually that focus on, cultivating kind of internal recognition that this is the path and this is the way forward, and ultimately kind of building your ally base, if you like, internally within an organization. Brilliant. Yeah. Callum, it's been an absolute pleasure, and you've done all of this off your what's it called? Hotspot. On your, I
think I need to give Vodafone a tip. They've done a great job.
Yeah, tip of the hat. Nice plug. Brilliant stuff. Well, hopefully we'll have you on again, but thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Really appreciate it.